There are stories buried beneath the earth, its tales so old, so unspeakable, that time itself has chosen to forget them. But the soil remembers, the bones scattered beneath our feet remember. And though the names have long since crumbled to dust, and the stones of their dwellings have been swallowed by the earth, what they did in the heart of one merciless winter remains etched into the marrow of mankind. Tight knots of humanity clinging together against the merciless elements, hunted by beasts, plagued by sickness, and forever at war with the cold. One such tribe, whose name was spoken as the Hollow Kin, lived deep in a valley forgotten by the sun. Even in summer, mist clung to the hollows like a pale hand, and when winter came, it came with a vengeance. The last of the marrow had been scraped from the bones of their fallen. A gnawing primal whisper, older than language, older than fear. Take the flesh. It is life. It is warmth. It is survival. The hunters who ventured out did not return, swallowed by the storm or by something else that stalked the white wastes. These were people who spoke to stones, who left offerings for the wind and named their dead beneath the roots of ancient trees. But hunger does not honor tradition. Hunger is a god unto itself. A desperate, blood-soaked pact whispered into the howling dark. They would not die. Not like this, in the cold, nameless, forgotten by even the stars. If they must feed upon the flesh of their own, so be it. Better to live as monsters than perish as martyrs. The line between man and beast, between kin and prey, vanished. They did not speak. There was no need. The unspoken law had been broken, but the silence between them screamed. And if you listen closely, in the deep of winter, when the wind howls like a starving wolf through the barren trees, you might hear them whisper still, that with every body burned for warmth, every bone cracked for marrow, they invited it closer. It was said to walk upon the snow without leaving tracks. Its face a hollow mask of ice, its fingers long and pale as sun-bleached antlers. Where it passed, the living grew desperate, and the dead did not stay buried. And when they buried their dead in the night, they returned by dawn, standing at the threshold of their dwellings. Faces frozen in agony, eyes gone, flesh stiff and gray. Crops refused to grow where the bones of kin had been buried. Children born in that land carried the mark of the winter. Pale eyes, brittle hair, and a hunger that no meat could satisfy. Survival. The flesh, once taboo, became salvation. The bones were cracked for marrow, the blood warmed for broth. The fire burned a little brighter, cold retreated. That in the deep of winter, when the frost creeps against the window pane, and the trees groan under the weight of snow, you might see one of them watching, pale, hollow-eyed, lips cracked and bloodless. He had grown too weak to stand. His skin stretched thin over brittle bones, eyes sunken and glassy. They buried him in the snow outside the dwelling, as was their custom. But by nightfall the blizzard had consumed the grave, out in the world outside. The storm still howled, snow still fell. But within the hearts of the hollow kin, their eyes grew hollow, their laughter sharp and brittle. The boundaries of family blurred, and blood ties dissolved beneath the shadow of hunger. By morning, a woman named Arelna, driven by a hunger that gnawed at her sanity, followed the half-buried tracks. This is the story of a hunger older than kingdoms, a desperate act born of frost, madness, and blood. Long before the cities, before written words and kings draped in silk, there were small tribes. The Hollow Kin were a people marked by their sorrow. The old songs, passed from mother to daughter by brittle firesides, spoke of a time when the land turned against them. Crops withered, the rivers turned to ice, and the beasts of the forest vanished, leaving only tracks in the snow. Ow. The skies darkened as if mourning something unnamed, and the wind carried voices no living tongue could decipher. It was during the third winter of the Great Frost when the true horror began. The Hollow Kin, already thinned by sickness and starvation, found themselves trapped within their hollowed hill dwellings. Buried under snow so deep, no light could breach its weight. The world outside was a pale, endless grave. They had no food. Stores of smoked meat and dried roots were gone. It was then that a voice spoke, not from the lips of any elder or shaman, but from within the hearts of the starving themselves. They resisted at first. The first to die was a boy no older than 10 winters. The others found her hours later, her mouth stained red, the boy's frozen body clutched to her chest like a babe. That night, by the flickering light of a dying fire, they made a choice. They began with the weakest, the sick, those too far gone to feel the blade or the cold. It was not murder, they told themselves. It was mercy. But with each life taken, something shifted. Brothers turned against brothers. Mother slit the throat of her own daughter while she slept, her hands trembling, her eyes dry. And somewhere, deep within the white woods, something ancient watched. The elders spoke of the bond-taker, a spirit of the endless winter, born from the first breath of death itself. Some claimed it was the bond-taker that had cursed their valley, that each act of blood-fed survival was a prayer to its name. And though they told themselves it was madness, mere superstition born of cold and fear, by the 7th week of that unending winter, none dared to sleep alone. The howling wind spoke with voices. The snow seemed to shift with shapes. The hollow kin were no longer a tribe. They were a nest of the damned. And though the storm would one day pass and the snow would melt, the soil of that valley would remain tainted. It is said that those born of that bloodline still walk the earth. For you see, this story is not merely a tale of ancient desperation. It is a reminder, a warning whispered from the past, that when the world grows cold and the food runs thin, mankind's greatest predator has always been itself. And it will be again. The spring never came. Or perhaps when it did, the hollow kin could no longer recognize it. The snows melted, yes, in time. The river creaked and bled its first trickle, and the trees shed their white skins. But where warmth should have returned, there was only rot. Where buds should have bloomed, there was only silence. Even the birds, once the first heralds of thaw, refused to sing above that cursed valley. And within the hollowed hill, the tribe no longer whispered prayers to the old gods. Older than fire, older than language. A force not worshipped with songs, but with silence, blood, and obedience. They had found a new one. Her eyes no longer held madness, but a strange calm, like a beast long starved that had finally fed. They were not words nor maps, but hunger itself rendered in shape, circle within a spiral, a ribcage missing its heart, a single open mouth surrounded by outstretched hands. She no longer trembled when the wind howled, or when the dead returned with blank stares. She walked barefoot into the woods at dusk, eyes closed, head raised as if listening to something only she could hear. The hunger. Not a deity born of stars or carved in wood. No, this was more primal. It began with Arelna, the first to taste the flesh of her kin. She began to mark the walls of the dwelling with symbols. Crude at first, carved with bone or soot, then later etched in blood. She called it the one beneath, the one that waits, the one that gives, the one that devours. When the wind passed over it, it carried a note that was not natural, not music. Something between a moan and a memory. Femurs sharpened into totems, pointing toward the mountain's dark heart. And in the center of it all, a pit, and the others followed, closer to the source, closer to the truth. They were hollowed people now, their old names forgotten, their roles dissolved. There were no more mothers, no more fathers, only the fed and the starving. Something massive and slow, like a beast slumbering under stone. It pulsed in their minds, not in words, but in cravings. They saw it as an endless coil of ribs buried in black soil, or a mouth filled with teeth that grew inward. Some called it a mother, others a womb. Some saw it as a mirror. The strongest among them claimed the first bite, and left bones arranged in spirals outside their dens. Infants too weak to cry were not mourned, they were offered. The line between death and devotion blurred, until it vanished entirely. Those who resisted were cast out, or worse, buried alive in the thawing soil. An elder begged to be skinned alive, believing the one beneath would grant him rebirth. And when Arelna herself stepped into the pit, silent, naked, smeared with marrow, not a soul stopped her. To feed the one below, birds flew in circles to escape the air above it. Deer gave birth to stillborns with hollow sockets, wolves died mid-howl. The trees blackened at the roots, and the tribe, if one could still call it that, no longer needed outsiders to feed the pit. They began to build shrines in the woods, not with stone, but with bones. Rib cages lashed together into arches. Skulls hung from branches like fruit. It was not dug by hand. The earth had opened there, unasked. They called it the mouth, and they sang into it, not with voices, but with breath, long and low. Some claimed the pit whispered back. By then, they had stopped cooking the flesh. Fire was for warmth, not food. The rawness was holy, and the truth was this: they no longer ate to live. They lived to eat, but not everything inside them was gone. At night, they still dreamed, not of the past that had rotted away, but of something beneath them. And in those dreams, it always asked the same thing. More flesh, more offering, more of you. Soon, even the animals avoided the valley. They turned inward. A boy of 12 winters offered his own hand to the fire, claiming the meat within it tasted of dreams. They watched and waited. And when she did not return, they smiled. She had gone below to feed the god they had become. Centuries passed, the old roads choked with roots and rot. The names of the hollow kin faded from the tongues of men, reduced to a half-remembered ghost story told by drunkards and mad crones in crumbling villages. Maps marked the valley as cursed ground, the wither reach, and no hunter or woodsman dared tread too deep into its heart. But kingdoms fall, and wars grind down even the oldest warnings. Hardened men, faces rough as split timber, eyes dulled by death. A captain named Oren Kale led them, a man with a scar like a pale root curling down one cheek. And so it was that in the autumn of the year of pale suns, a band of men marched where none should have. They were soldiers, or what remained of them, worn and splintered by a war no bard would ever sing of, 5 in number, fleeing defeat and famine, driven by desperation and the promise of untamed land. They crossed the wither reach's broken border. The woods greeted them in silence. No wind, no birdsong. Even the leaves hung limp as though afraid to fall. A heaviness, the scent of old graves turned to dust. On the second night, they came upon the remains of a structure, little more than a ring of stones and a blackened stump at its center. Carvings marked the rocks, crude spirals and shapes like grasping hands. Stones ringed its mouth, marked with the same bone-carved symbols they'd seen before. And around it, the ground was littered with bones. Old shrines, one muttered. But Kale lingered, claimed no faith. Yet something about the air here gnawed at the back of his throat. By dawn, they pressed deeper. It was Fen, the youngest of them, who first found the pit. Half hidden beneath roots, slick with frost, it yawned in the earth like a wound, too many, too small. The air thickened, carrying a dampness that stung the lungs. Shadows moved oddly here, stretching too long, retreating too slow. The men spoke little. Their sleep came fitful. The fire was dying, and beyond its thin light, shapes loomed. Small, pale, none bleached by time, as though the earth itself refused to let them rest. God's mercy, Fen whispered. The trees grew too thick to retreat, and night came too soon. They made camp beside the pit. But there was no mercy here. They should have turned back. But soldiers make poor listeners when hunger gnaws their bellies and frost nips their bones. A mistake written in the marrow of their fate. Just the soft, desperate sounds of teeth against flesh, of old bones breaking under the weight of need. The fire barely took, but their hunger remained. In death, in soil, in whatever half-existence they clung to. And in the deep watches of the night, something moved. Kale woke to the sound of soft, wet footsteps, the kind made by bare feet on cold soil. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the last embers. No trace of men, save for scattered weapons and a line of footprints leading down into the hollowed earth. Eyes too wide, eyes too hungry. The hollow kin had not vanished, the faint papery laughter of things long dead. Not truly. Time had gnawed their flesh, twisted their forms, left their bodies little more than brittle skin and bone. They came in silence, no shriek, no battle cry. Kale fought, axe in hand, the others too. But you cannot kill what is already claimed by the earth. By dawn, the camp was gone. The fire cold, the pit undisturbed, in the distance, the wind finally stirred, carrying on it a single wordless sound: hunger. Some say that to this day, if you walk too near the wither reach on an autumn night, you might hear it. the gnawing, scratching beneath the soil. For the hollow can endure, in flesh, in soil, in you. And the earth remembers, always. In the age of gaslight and rusted rail, when men traded bone charms for firearms and claimed they'd tamed the dark, ere lingered still certain truths that no iron nor empire could smother. For though the world marched forward, the old earth beneath its feet never forgot. And it was into this thin-skinned, flickering modern world that the morning vow was born. A sect without scripture. A brotherhood of broken men and glass-eyed women. Their doctrine was whispered, never written. It's their God, not named in any tongue still spoken. But their symbol was ancient. A spiral within a spiral, encircled by a ring of outstretched hands. They called themselves the Faithful of the Hunger. The vow's origins were unclear. Others swore a ragged grimoire surfaced in a burned-out abbey in the north. A book bound in skin, its pages inked in blood turned brown with centuries. What is known as this? In the year of bitter frost, 5 members of the vow made pilgrimage to Wither Reach. They believed the stories. They sought not to flee the hunger, but to become it. Their leader, a man known only as Father Brannock, claimed to have seen visions in the dark between his dreams, of a vast mouth beneath the earth, lined with countless teeth, gnashing and endless, waiting to be fed. He called it the Devourer below, and he promised his followers that through its favor they would be remade, deathless, hungerless, beings of bone and soil and will. The old warnings did not deter them. The land met them like a tomb cracked open. The trees hung with desiccated shapes that might have once been birds. The air stank of stagnant water and ancient marrow. At dusk, under a moon choked by storm clouds, they crossed into the heart of the Wither Reach. They carried with them offerings, relics of the dead, teeth still bearing scraps of gum, the severed tongues of oath-breakers, and 3 infants taken from the gutters of a nameless city. The stones were blackened with age, marked by sigils so old they seemed part of the rock itself, and around it the earth was cracked and hollow, as though something within stirred. At the heart of the woods they found the remains of the old pit. The mouth that had sunk deeper with centuries, but the shape endured. The ceremony began at midnight. The faithful chanted in a tongue scraped from older bones. They bled themselves into the soil. They burned the infants. They called upon the devourer to awaken, and in the churning dark it answered. The earth buckled. Twisted echoes of the hollow kin, their flesh a patchwork of soil and pale sinew, eyes as hollow as the graves they'd never escaped. The wind screamed like 1,000 weeping mouths. The pit belched forth a mist thick and cloying, stinking of old meat and damp stone. Figures emerged, not men, not holy. They did not attack. They knelt. A hand emerged, pale as candle wax, thin as branches, and seized Brannock's throat. His scream never left his lips. He was pulled down, and the pit drank him. And in that moment Brannock wept. He believed he had succeeded, bridged the gap between old hunger and new flesh, that he would command them, that he had become the mouth's chosen. One man leapt willingly, shrieking praises into the gnawing dark. But hunger obeys no master. The earth cracked open. Villages nearby spoke of missing children, of animals born eyeless, of things seen moving in fields where no man walked. The others followed, some dragged by hands, some by their own madness. By dawn, only the smoldering remains of their fire remained. The Wither Reach no longer kept its hunger to itself. The ground beyond its borders soured into the flesh of the mad, into walls of asylums and behind mirrors fogged by breath. The faithful were gone, but their legacy endured. The spiral symbol began to appear, carved into church doors, a hunger unbound. And those few who still dared whisper old names claimed the mouth no longer waited for offerings. It had begun to seek. The world had long forgotten the name Wither Reach. On modern maps, it was a nameless smudge of tangled forest, marked only by elevation lines and vague warnings of poor roads. Most dismissed it as an old-growth woodland, untouched by rail, bypassed by asphalt, and of no value to anyone but stubborn deer and half-blind hermits. But for Elias Cross, it was a puzzle. It was a footnote in a forgotten journal, a faded name scribbled in the margins of a 17th century grimoire Hedi found rotting in the archives of an abandoned seminary. Cross was no stranger to dark things, an archivist by trade and obsessive by nature. He spent his days parsing the half-buried bones of old cults, dead languages, and forgotten rites. Most of it was harmless superstition, the fevered scrawls of madmen terrified of their own shadows. But this was different. The morning vow, scrawled in charcoal behind the pulpit of an abandoned chapel, and once carved into the chest of a murdered clergyman in 1842, Father Brannock, the devourer below. The same spiral within a spiral, symbol had surfaced in no fewer than 6 separate sources over 3 centuries, painted in blood on the walls of a sunken manor. And all roads, all whispers, all madness pointed back to Witherreach. The final piece came from a ruined asylum ledger, dated 1891, listing a patient known only as the Pale Man, his last recorded words. The earth remembers. It waits. It wants. Elias couldn't resist. Armed with an old revolver, a battered field journal, and a growing sense that he was chasing something older than human sin, he set out into the Reach. The forest met him with the same awful hush spoken of in the old texts. No birds, no insects, only the slow, death-thick scent of wet soil and something beneath it, the cold tang of old marrow. He found remnants. A half-buried stone circle, a rusted blade hung from a tree like a forgotten offering. The early entries were orderly, filled with archaic prayers and passages from dead scriptures. But as the pages wore on, the writing twisted, the language breaking down into spirals of madness. And, at last, a ruined journal, leather swollen with damp, pages curling like the flesh of drowned things. The name on the inner cover, Father Brannock. Its contents were fractured, written in a hand that decayed over time. And in one final, blood-blotched scrawl, "It is not buried, it is not bound. It is in the marrow of the earth." Shapes moved between the trees, low, pale, crawling, eyes glinting like old bone in the dark. Not men, not holy, waits in us. As Elias read those words, the earth beneath him shifted, a faint pulse, a breath, and in the distance, a sound like teeth gnashing in wet soil. He stumbled back, light trembling in his hand. They had waited not for Brannock. Faces appeared in the bark, twisted, empty-eyed. Hands reached from the soil. A child's voice sang a wordless, broken lullaby. The old pit yawned open once more. The air reeked of centuries of old blood and sour breath. A voice ancient and hollow rose from its depths. Not for the faithful, for anyone. Now they had found one. The earth cracked. "Feed me." Elias ran. His eyes dulled to glass. And in his sleep, he spoke in dead tongues. Words the earth itself still remembers. The trees blurred. The ground buckled beneath his feet. And just as the pit's cold mist kissed his skin, he crossed the old border. And the forest fell silent. He lived, but not whole. Elias Cross never returned to his archives, never spoke of what he saw. His hair went to frost within a month. On his final night, he carved a message into the wall of his room with his own broken nails. The hunger is moving. And somewhere far beneath the soil of Witherreach, the devourer stirs. The earth remembers, and it waits. For you. The town of Ashbrook had always been an ordinary place. Gray stone cottages, a crumbling church, a pub older than the country itself. It sat in a shallow valley, its streets curling like the spine of some long-dead beast. Nothing truly remarkable ever happened there, till the spring of 1923. It began with the earth. First it was a simple thing, a crack in the cemetery grounds. The local gravedigger, old Thomas Muir, swore the soil itself had moved beneath his spade. It felt soft where it should have been firm. That when he pressed his ear to the earth, he could hear it. A faint, distant knowing. No one listened. Thomas was 72, and half of those years he'd spent pickled in gin. Then the livestock began to die. First a cow, then to pigs. Then an entire coop of hens, their bodies bloated and eyes sunken, though no predator came near the corpses.
Oh.
The village physician called it a fever of the blood. The vicar whispered of pestilence, but neither could explain the marks. Beneath the skin of the dead animals, Bones had turned brittle, hollow, the marrow within gone, as though drained. Still, the town clung to its routine. The school bell rang. The pub poured its ale. The church sang its hymns. And beneath their feet, something ancient unfurled. Carved deep, the wood blackened and soft around the edges. Children spoke of voices in the mist, low, wet, and calling them by name. Old Mrs. Coetz, the town's midwife, found spirals carved into the bark of trees along the riverbank. She told the vicar. He told her to pray. The animals weren't the only ones changing. By midsummer, the townsfolk themselves grew pale, thin eyes shadowed. Some claimed it was the lingering chill of an unusually harsh spring. Others blamed the war still echoing in the marrow of the nation. But beneath the surface, the sickness bloomed. And it was young Daniel Ashcroft, a boy of 9, who vanished first. Vanished from his bed one night. No sign of struggle, no prints in the dust. Only a small, bloodless handprint left on the inside of his window pane. A search was mounted, and at its base, the soil crumbled away into a narrow, impossible hollow, as though the earth had swallowed itself. They combed the woods, dredged the river. They never found him. But they found something else. Beneath an ancient oak, half swallowed by the earth, was a stone, blackened with age, marked with a faint spiral. The men sealed it with rock and timber. Whispers of a valley where the earth devoured the living. Of the hollow kin, of a hunger that no flesh could fill. But the next morning it lay open again. And in its darkness, a voice whispered, in a tongue none alive should have known, "Feed." It was then, at last, that the stories returned. The old men, once boys who'd heard their grandmother's warnings of wither reach, began to remember, and they realized too late. The old borders had broken. What was buried beneath wither reach had crept through soil and stone, seeped through roots and water, and now stirred beneath Ashbrook. The hunger had come home. By harvest, a third of the village had vanished. Some fled, some were taken, some willingly walked into the earth. The rest, no one speaks of the rest. Ashbrook was eventually abandoned, its name erased from records, the church left to rot, earthed a graveyard overgrown. Only one warning remains, carved into the crumbling lintel above the church's doorway. The earth remembers. And they say on certain nights, when the wind turns strange and the mist crawls low over the hills, you can still hear it. The gnawing, the soft, wet shuffle of something moving beneath your feet. Hunger. It waits. And now, it waits for you. In the spring of 2025, a team of historical anthropologists from Greywater University embarked on an unremarkable field study. The project's scope: to trace lost medieval settlements in the northern woodlands, where ancient records spoke of villages swallowed by plague, war, and time. Leading them was Dr. Eleanor Voss, 37, sharp-eyed, her hair streaked with premature gray. Known for her obsession with obscure folklore, she had read whispers of Ashbrook. She had seen the names, a spiral sigil in a centuries-old chapel ledger, the scrawled phrase the earth remembers, in a forgotten diary dated 1923, and she could not resist. The team arrived in early May. The land was wrong. Their compasses spun erratically. Wildlife was absent, even the insects were silent, not in any visible sense. The hills still rolled, the trees still swayed, but the air felt thick, as though it hung heavier in the lungs. But curiosity is a hungrier thing than fear. Beneath it, they found the church floor carved with spirals. Hundreds of them, overlapping, some crude, others intricate. Within a week, they uncovered the old Ashbrook Chapel. Its stone sagged and roof caved in. When one of the students, Marcus Bell, descended to retrieve a fragment of bone, the soil gave way in a pit. It had caved in long ago, but the earth within remained loose. What he fell into was not earth. It was a passage. Walls of packed, blackened marrow, bones fused with roots. Symbols drawn in the smeared remains of things no one wished to name. At the end of the narrow tunnel, a chamber. And at its center, the mow, not a pit now, an opening. Ringed with ancient bone and the ossified remnants of hands reaching up, fused into the stone. Breathed. Slowly, wetly. The pulse of something enormous far beneath the ground. Marcus did not return. The others followed, first by duty. The air was thick with the scent of old marrow and wet stone, then by fear, then by compulsion. The earth grew warmer as they descended, the walls wept, and in the dark voices, not spoken, not heard, felt, feed, come, be one. Pale, brittle, their eyes hollow, mouths still working in a silent hymn. Dr. Voss, at last, stood before the mouth. It opened, not wide, just enough. Within it, she saw not teeth nor tongue, but the faces of those long dead. She felt herself pulled forward, not by hands, and the spirals began to bloom once more along the trees and the soil on the skin of the dead. By the hunger, and as the others watched, not one moved to stop her. She stepped into the dark. The earth sealed behind her, and above, the chapel stones cracked, the land sighed. The hunger was no longer sleeping. Today Ashbrook does not appear on maps. The locals will not speak of it. The university disavowed the expedition. No bodies were recovered. But on certain nights, the mist still clings too long to the hills. The trees still bleed sap the color of rusted marrow. And those who walk too close claim to hear it. A soft, wet gnawing beneath the earth. Somewhere deep below, a voice older than language, older than man. Feed, the earth remembers. And it always will.